For the next 12 years, Kraft's need to kill and torture was insatiable.
His MO was to pick up like prep a young Marine off on a weekend, and he would offer them, hey, I have some beers. You want beer? Hey, I have some pot. I have some drugs. Do you want to do some drugs? He would either spice the beer with Valium or other tranquilizers, or he would just offer them as a means to continue the party. Once he had control of his victim, sometimes the victims were tortured to an extreme degree, emasculated, and he would then just dump the bodies out on the highway. He made very little effort, if any effort, to hide most of his victims, and would just dump them out on the side of the road as he drove. Just yet another indignity to perform. What's interesting about Kraft is that the police knew for a long time they had more than one.
From 1971 to 1978, dead men and boys were regularly found dumped along California's highways. Then, in 1979, there was a sudden explosion of dead male bodies beside Los Angeles freeways. These were obviously the work of a homosexual serial killer, but the way these men were killed did not fit with the other mutilated bodies found earlier. This new frenzy of highway serial killing was the work of William Bonner, California's second highway homosexual serial killer. 2 years younger than Randy Kraft, he was born and raised in Manhattan. With a drunkard father and frail mother, he ended up spending much of his time with his grandfather, a convicted child molester. Soon, William Bonner was doing this himself. After high school, he joined the military and distinguished himself in the Vietnam War. Returning home in 1969 at the age of 23, he resumed molesting young boys, for which he was arrested. By 1979, back on the streets, living in LA, resuming molesting, he told LA that he would never go to prison again because he would never leave a witness. For the next year, he raped and killed an estimated 40 young men and boys. Put under surveillance by the police, he was arrested for molesting a 15-year-old boy. Once in custody, he confessed to abducting, raping, and killing 21 boys. For most people and the press, the capture of William Bonner heralded the end of the highway killings. But when the murders continued, the public was shocked. However, the police knew all along that there had been 2 killers. As is often the case, Randy Kraft was caught by dumb luck.
They had a task force in place for many, many years looking for Mr. Kraft and were unable to do so. But one night on a lonely stretch of highway, a couple of highway patrolmen saw a car weaving around. They pulled him over. The driver got out of the car and came back again, which is like a red flag for the police. They might be something going on in the car that the driver doesn't want to know about. There was a young man in the front seat of the car who appeared asleep. But he wasn't asleep. He was dead. And not only was there a dead young man in his car, there were photographs of other young men who had turned up on the side of the road in the recent past in there, and practical chilling a list of, I believe, 60-some little memory triggers for him. Little 1 or 2 or 3 word descriptions of various killings that he performed on this piece of paper. So he was convicted, I believe, of 11 murders, but the notion is that his list contained 60-plus entries and was drafted.
law enforcement got a better understanding of the difference between a serial killer's MO, his modus operandi, and his signature, his perverted psychological need. William Barnett and Randy Kraft had the same MO, but different signatures. One got psychological gratification from raping and killing. The other got gratification from killing and mutilating. But their MOs were the same: targeting hitchhikers from a car and then dumping the body on the highway. So the largest subset of victims in the serial killer victim pool is made up of the less followed by easy prey, such as folks in a hospital or nursing home. But sometimes it is a specific characteristic an unsuspecting victim might possess. Ted Bundy, like brunette women with blue eyes who resemble the girlfriend. Sometimes victims are just in the wrong place at the wrong time, as were 5 co-eds at the University of Florida, all victims of the Gainesville Ripper. Danny Rowland. Danny Rowland was born in 1954 in Shreveport, Louisiana. His father, James, a police officer, often abused him, his mother, and his brother, Kevin. In 1990, Danny left Louisiana, but not before killing 3 people with the signature of mutilation that would become his trademark of killing. And when he killed again in Florida, he fit the definition of a serial killer. Allusions to serial murderer Ted Bundy were inevitable. The Washington-born killer had murdered co-eds at Florida State University in Tallahassee in 1976. But the slaughter of the Gainesville victims was more like Jack the Ripper. Like the London Ripper, death had not been enough for Danny Rowland.
Danny Rowland, who killed 5 college students at the University of Florida in 1990, would excise the nipples of his female victims and carry them off in a little plastic bag to enjoy himself with later on.
Never showing any remorse for his heinous crimes, Danny Rowland, a true psychopath, was put to death by lethal injection on October 25th, 2006. The Beltway snipers, John Allen Mahoney and Lee Boyd Malvo, who randomly killed 17 innocent victims in 2002, chose victims randomly, as did the Zodiac Killer, still at large today, who took the lives of at least 5 unsuspecting young victims in the San Francisco Bay Area, and the son of Sam, David Richard Berkowitz, who shot 6 unsuspecting victims in the summer of 1977, and Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, who killed ordinary people like you, who thought that they were safe in their home. So, just because you do not meet the stereotypical serial killer victim pool, never think you're entirely safe. In all these cases, the media played a role. Right after World War II, American news media, particularly television, focused its bright lights on the serial killer phenomenon. Case in point, the 1946 lipstick killer, William Herons. The press has always given serial killers AKAs or nicknames, denoting the gruesomeness of their crimes. At the turn of the 20th century, it was Jack the Ripper, H.H. Holmes, the Doctor of Death, Jane Toppin, the Angel of Death. Then, in the 1920s, came the Brooklyn Vampire, Albert Fish. It's as if these mad killers possessed an alter ego, a split personality, a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This idea would play a role in the defense of William Harris. William Harris was different from earlier serial killers. Born in 1929, he grew up in an affluent Chicago family and started his killing at an early age, as a teenager.
The lipstick killer. He would, after killing a female victim, go into her bathroom and take her lipstick and scrawl, "Catch me before I kill again." He apparently felt guilty and wanted to get apprehended.
By the age of 13, young Bill had become a pretty strange boy. He took to petty crime, burglary, and cross-dressing. Then, on June 3rd, 1945, Aarons was looting the Chicago apartment of Josephine Ross when his victim woke and caught him in the act. Attacking her ruthlessly, he cut her throat and stabbed her several times. Later, he said, "I wandered aimlessly from room to room, enjoying multiple orgasms." 5 months later, 33-year-old Frances Brown emerged from her bathroom to find Aarons rifling through her purse. As she began to scream, he shot her twice and then fetched a kitchen knife to finish off the job. Dragging his victim into the bathroom, Aarons tried in vain to wash her blood away, then left her draped across the tub, half covered with a housecoat. This is when he wrote in lipstick, "For heaven's sake, catch me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." A month later, on January 7th, 1946, he invaded the bedroom of 6-year-old Suzanne Degnan, abducting the child and leaving a written demand for $20,000 as a ruse to baffle the police. Retreating to a nearby basement, Aarons murdered the child and dismembered her remains with a hunting knife. 6 months later, the 17-year-old Aarons was caught attempting another murder, and confessed to killing the 3 women. Except Aarons claimed that it was not actually he who killed the women. It was his alter personality, George Merman, short for Murder Man, who killed those women. As the youngest serial killer ever incarcerated, young William Aarons spent the rest of his long life in jail. Many criminologists saw that serial killers had entered the American consciousness through the new electronic media. Television and radio had taken the sex and violence of serial killing and turned it into drama, along with all the suggestive nicknames. Almost overnight, the idea of serial killing had become a part of our fantasies.
And then they love the usually is the one responsible for that. Because sometimes the killer is himself. BTK signed his notes to the police. BTK, mind, torture, kill. BTK. And a couple times he wrote, how many more people do I have to kill before I can get some attention from you guys? So, BTK, Son of Sam, where did that come from? That came from him. The Zodiac, that came from him. He named himself. But some of them get named, like D'Angelo. The media named him the original Night Stalker, California Rapist, etc. So sometimes the names come from press, sometimes they come from themselves, sometimes they come from the police.
Media, which means fiction and nonfiction, documentaries, news reports, the whole basket, is always looking for an audience. always needs to find something that will keep an audience attention, make an audience tune in or buy a book or, read a newspaper. So headline grabbers are more important than somebody who is just killing prostitutes, for example. So somebody who's killing college students is more important to media typically because it will get more viewers and more readers. In that case, you will tend to have media skewed towards certain type of killers. So audience that then tend to think of serial killers along those types. The famous ones would be Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Son of Sam, the Hillside Stranglers. You tend to have those white guys who seem to have it together, who pick victims that make the audience feel vulnerable. So they want to tune in. So it's quite titillating and there's a lot of sensation built around it. And so then you'll hear statements from, news reporters like, there aren't any black serial killers. Well, not in the media, but it's certainly in research books. We know about them. But I remember when Anthony Sowell in Cleveland was found with bodies in his yard and in his house. They were prostitutes primarily. That got some headlines just because the bodies were there in the house where he's living.
Anthony Edward Sowell is an American serial killer known as the Cleveland Strangler. He was arrested in October 2009 after the bodies of 11 women were discovered by police investigators at his Cleveland, Ohio duplex. In 2011, Sowell was charged with 11 counts of aggravated murder and 74 counts of rape, kidnapping, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. He sits on death row.
We don't cover this, the legal proceedings, the trial, not really. There's very little known about him aside from the initial headlines. I think he should qualify in every way like Jeffrey Dahmer did, but he doesn't. So that's media. Is it accurate? Some of the documentaries are accurate, but I've definitely had media people who wanted to believe certain myths. And so if I didn't say something to them that confirmed those myths, I'm cut and the myths continue.
You also can't deny the role of the media. Now, I'm not a big believer in, hey, you watch a serial killer crime on TV, you go commit one. I don't necessarily believe there's a causal relationship there. Maybe in some cases, maybe. But more than that, I think what it does is it distributes the notion. Maybe you're a mixed up person with a lot of hatred and a lot of negative feelings, and you've been casting about and expressing in a lot of different ways. But then you watch a crime drama where somebody commits some sort of act and you yourself derive some satisfaction out of vicariously experiencing the act they committed. Maybe that makes you more likely to go and try and commit the act. Perhaps by reading about serial murder, by seeing it on TV, you develop a fantasy that, let's face it, I think the centerpiece of a lot of this crime is fantasy fulfillment. Okay? You think about it, you think about it, you think about it, you think about it, you live it, you live it, you live it, and suddenly the thing that was purely imagination, you desire to see that fleshed out in reality.
Once serial killing became known, once it saturated the American family and home, the fantasy became a reality for some people.
Sometimes this steady drip exposure to violence in movies and television may increase the likelihood because there's this sense of humanity. And when things are familiar, sometimes we're influenced by that. But if one has seen this kind of footage for years and years and years, give me may not be anybody out there saying, go kill the person you don't like. But in that person's psyche, in their bones, there's this familiarity. I think that's it. I think there's a familiarity with violence in this culture that implicitly may send a signal to somebody with violent instincts. You have permission to kill.
Perhaps the worst case of copycat serial killing belongs to two men. Two men who were health workers, Charles Cullen and Donald Harvey. Harvey, the self-described original angel of death, was born in Ohio in 1952. Harvey's killing spree, moving from hospital to hospital in that state, lasted 17 years, 1970 to 1987.
Donald Harvey was a young man raised in Kentucky, eastern Kentucky, as I recall. He had been molested, been raped by his uncle and then he promised never to tell him because if he did, they probably hurt his mother. That was never going to happen, but he didn't know that. He was just a little boy. And so he never told him, he kept the secret. And he was a good student, but he became suicidal after he graduated from high school. He joined the military, he was suicidal there. Discharged from the military. He, I think, figured things out that he wasn't going to kill himself. He got a job working in the hospital as an orderly. And then over the course of the next several years, in 3 different hospitals, he killed 57 men. And they were all at the same age as the men who had been abusing him. He couldn't kill them. He had already died. But he had the power to kill them. He had the power to kill these men. So he'd be like proxy murders. And he would put cyanide in them. Like his last murder, there was enough cyanide to kill him. I mean, it was amazing what cyanide did. He was a little sadistic at times because he did lose, in one case, for this elderly man, couldn't fight back. He had a catheter and he took a coat hanger and crept it to the catheter in his bladder several times and killed him that way. Very painful. But I think for the most part, it was to give him large amounts of cyanide. And they killed him pretty quickly. And he pleaded guilty, no death penalty.
In 2017, Harvey was beaten to death in his prison cell. A year after Harvey's last victim died, along came Charles Cullen with his first victim in a New Jersey hospital.
Cullen has admitted to 29 murders and 6 attempted murders. Officials in this case believe there are many more to which he has not admitted. He made a deal to give up all his victims in exchange for no death penalty. He was caught. He operated in Pennsylvania and New Jersey. I think there were 10 different institutions in 16 years where he killed. So he's a pretty prolific healthcare serial killer. He admired Donald Harvey, who was another very more prolific healthcare serial killer nurse. And so most of these medications, he took advantage of medications not being accounted for, computer systems not being locked up. Sometimes he would just take them and dump them in a wastebasket just because, just to see, they're not watching these. And he's given a long confession where he talks about, here's how you thwart someone like me. But even when they got computerized, he figured out how to manipulate the computer system so that it would seem like he had taken the medication out and then put it back, although he hadn't. And then he would use some toxic medication on a patient for whom that should have never been used. And it was actually someone in poison control center who called the hospital where he finally was arrested and said, you have a serial killer there. They said, no, we don't. And it went on for months before they finally stopped him.
Over his 16-year nursing career, Cullen, like his idol Donald Harvey, killed many patients who would not have died otherwise. This copycat serial killer makes it clear that any one of us can be at risk of a serial murderer.
Shit.
Serial murderers are often spurred by the myths of the media, movies, television, and true crime print. More and more serial murderers
Shit.
want to create their own public legacy, as the media creates anti-hero status for these
damn it.
officers while forgetting about the victims.
One thing about serial murder that strikes me is that there's a preponderance, there's a plethora of ways to kill, motivations. It can be political.
Son of a bitch.
We have the traditional sex and power and greed. We have, in my case, communication. I did a study of 1,000 serial killers, and about
Sucks.
3/4 of them communicate before, during, and after the crime. And it's because of this communication. Things like the Mansons writing on walls, writing on walls with blood, people carving words and images into people's bodies. So I think that communication is a major, the need to communicate is a major motivation. Also, the media coverage is a major motivation. The DTK killer, in one of his letters to the newspaper, said, how many people do I have to kill before I get some media attention? Which kind of very bluntly puts that thesis. Many killers are motivated by the media coverage. And while the crimes are ongoing, they eagerly and zealously pursue newspaper articles, magazine articles, and electronic accounts of the crime.
Perhaps the most famous case of a serial killer using the media as part of his heinous murders is the case of the Zodiac Killer.
Everybody who becomes interested in the subject of serial killers sort of finds one or another that fascinates them maybe the most. But I think for me, it's got to be the Zodiac Killer. I think the fact that he wasn't apprehended obviously plays into it. But I think even more than that, the letters to the police, how the distance that he had. It was obvious with Zodiac that killing was his aim. He killed people in cars, he killed couples. He obviously had something against young couples. And there's some psychology, I'm sure, some psychology of the Zodiac, I'm sure, that plays into that. But also the outfit, right? On that one murder that he committed by that lake near San Francisco, one of the victims survived. He tells the tale of this bizarre outfit.
Okay, that's done.
A squared off bag on his head with a Zodiac symbol on his chest. That to me adds a level of fascination to the crime, simply because this is a person whose fantasy life was being led to such an extreme degree that they actually produce a uniform for themselves. That's unique.
Since the Zodiac Killer was never caught, there are no pictures, no childhood stories to tell. Only handwritten letters, postcards, and his infamous Zodiac costume. Many have called him the perfect serial killer. The first guy was a teenage couple, David Barry, 17, and Betty Lou Jensen, 16, shot dead on December 20th, 1968. They were followed 6 months later with another shooting. Michael Mayer, 19, and Darlene Farrell, 22. Darlene was killed with 9 bullets from a 9mm pistol pumped into her body. The young man shot 4 times, survived. Now the Zodiac called the police and said,
You will find the kid in a brown car. I shot them with a 9mm Luger. I also killed those kids last year. Goodbye.
the Zodiac loved the power of controlling power that he would extend to manipulating and terrifying a whole community through the media. No doubt, the Zodiac had seen how television, in its own twisted way, glorified the killing by the Manson family. He was becoming the first serial killer to kill for killing his sick. Then, he skillfully used the press to exalt his supposed godlike power.
If they can't torture, they can at least play a cat and mouse game with the police, taunting them with cryptic clues, feeling superior to law enforcement. That too gives them a sense of power. And finally, if everything else fails, they can at least terrify the community and become big shot celebrities, making the front page, the headlines, the 11 o'clock news. Everybody knows who they are now, even if it's only anonymously. They have determined our agenda, and that makes them feel really good about themselves.
Now the killer began sending a series of chilling communications to the press. Each signed with the astrological symbol of the zodiac. The letters were encoded to contain the longest each by two local high school teachers. The message read,
I will be reborn in paradise, and all those I have killed will become my slaves. I will not give you my name, because you'll try to slow or stop my collecting slaves for my afterlife.
Panic spread throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. The Zodiac, as he was now called, was killed again on September 29, 1969. On that fateful afternoon, college students Brian Hartman and Cecilia Shepard were relaxing along the shore of a Napa Valley lake. According to Brian, Cecilia noticed a man lingering in the shade of some trees nearby. Suddenly, he appeared wearing a black hood with eye slits and the zodiac symbol painted on it. The assailant held the frightened students at gunpoint. Brian and Cecilia were bound with clothesline. And just as they thought the ordeal was about to end, the Zodiac killer set upon them with a foot-long knife. When the savage attack was over, the stranger simply walked away and left his victims in agony. To prove he was responsible for this gory act, he inscribed the Zodiac symbol on the victim's car, and once again reported his crime and its location to the police. Cecilia Shepard was conscious when the cops arrived and gave a detailed description of the attack. Shepard lapsed into a coma during transport to the hospital and never regained consciousness. She died 2 days later. But Hartman survived to recount his tale to the press. The Zodiac's next and last confirmed kill was a cab driver. On October 11, 1969, Paul Stein met his maker.
He killed a taxi cab driver, and it very well may be that the only reason that taxi driver was killed was just so he would have another opportunity to call the police. He paused after killing this person to rip a piece of their shirt off, simply so he would be able to send it into the police and have a way of identifying, yes, I really am the killer of these people.
Zodiac would continue to taunt police and manipulate the press for years. He 340 symbol cipher, mailed November 8, 1969, remains unsolved. But there were no more confirmed killings. Although many were suspected before and after the 5 he killed and the 2 he wounded, the Zodiac would never be identified. He would become the most famous never captured serial killer after Jack the Ripper, and perhaps is still alive today. American culture and its urban settings, streets of prostitution, homeless and lost people, will continue providing the victim pool for serial killers. And the media, with its insatiable demand for true crime, books, movies, television, will continue telling brutal stories of American serial killers. William George Harris, Ronald David Preston Jr., Albert Fish, Harvey Murray Blackman, Clifford Robert Olson Jr., James D'Angelo, Sheila LaBarre, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer. Ordinary names, but for serial killers, ordinary names are never good enough. We have to give them names that capture their dark souls, names that capture the evil they have become, capture the rare unthinkable. The lipstick killer, the grim sleeper, the Brooklyn vampire, the lonely hearts killer, the beast of British Columbia, the Golden State killer, the avenging angel, the Milwaukee candle.
When you hear about somebody who moves from community to community, calculating who to kill next, which prostitute to get, these crimes shock the conscience because they are so out of the ordinary. They are so different from what, sadly, we've become quite used to. The more ordinary rape, the more ordinary assault, the more ordinary robbery, the more ordinary kidnapping. There are these crimes that just shock the conscience, and so I fully understand why the public is preoccupied with them. I think they are so outside the box that we have this understandable need to try to grasp. Why would somebody do that? That's human nature. Why would somebody take a rifle, sit behind a barricade, and wait for innocent victims? Why would somebody do that? Why would somebody look for vulnerable children, kidnap them, torture them sexually, and kill them? It's hard for us to wrap our minds around these kinds of crimes. And it makes complete sense to me that the average human being would be both fascinated by this, horrified by this, mystified by this, and preoccupied by this. Why? Why? Why?
At the turn of the 20th century, America was on the move. It was changing from a country of farmers and small towns into a nation of growing urban centers. First, railroads, Then cars made it possible for people to crisscross the nation. Immigrants poured in from across Europe. Many argued that this transformation turned the country into an industrial powerhouse and later enabled it to become the global leader it is today. But it also created the perfect killing field for serial murderers. Killing fields because nobody knew who their neighbors were anymore. Killing fields because pockets of poverty exploded with people who were lost to mainstream America. And killing fields because serial killers could move from one law enforcement jurisdiction to another. And nobody would realize they had a heinous murderer in their midst.
I think the evolution of large urban complex societies can sometimes provide the incubator for murder in the sense that we often know less about each other. There's more anonymity. And people who murder can sometimes go undetected because there isn't that kind of small town quality where everybody knows everyone else. There's more camouflage, there's more anonymity.
We have no monopoly of serial murder in the United States, but we kind of cornered the market. It isn't poverty that breeds serial killing. It is a breakdown in community. If you look carefully at where most of the serial killings have occurred, they're in places where there are lots of strangers, where there's no sense of community, where hundreds of thousands of people have relocated for the sake of a job, as a new beginning or maybe a last resort. And when they arrive in California or Alaska or New York State or Illinois or Florida or Texas, they have no support systems. They don't have their friends and family to get them through tough times. They have nobody around who says, look, Jimmy, you can make it. We'll help you get another job. We'll encourage you. We'll support you. Wherever you find lots of strangers, you find lots of serial murder.
No one serial killer took greater advantage of these changing social times and implanted in the imagination of the whole country the evil of the serial killer better than the murderous H.H. Holmes. He was born into a wealthy and respected New Hampshire family and given the name Herman Webster Mudgett. But as a boy, he was constantly bullied. And then came a day when the bullying went too far. His taunters took him to a doctor's office. There, they put the lifeless, bony fingers of a human skeleton upon his face. Far from being horrified, Herman found the experience fascinating, even thrilling. There, his ghoulish interest in human anatomy was born. Herman began by dissecting kittens, dogs, rats, any animal he could find.
There are a number of cases involving serial murderers where if you drill deep and you look at their own personal histories, what you find is that they themselves have been victims of abuse, sometimes torture, as children. And one of the consequences of that abuse is ultimately the murder of another person. But in between, one often finds evidence of a child who's been a victim of abuse, who for a number of years tortures animals as a way to deal with their own victimization. And the torturing of animals can sometimes evolve over time into the torture, abuse, and ultimately murder of another human being. It is very common to find that perpetrators of serial murder themselves were subjected to horrific abuse as children.
At the age of 18, Herman married Clara Levering, the daughter of a rich local farmer. 1 year later, Herman left rural New Hampshire to attend the University of Michigan Medical School. There, he He saw opportunities in the hospital wards and dissection rooms to gain access to corpses for his insurance scams. It was here he gave himself his own nickname, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, H.H. Holmes. His insurance scams were brilliant. Holmes stole cadavers from medical laboratories, disfigured them, planted them where they would be found as accidents, and then claimed they were relatives of the one and only H.H. Holmes. Having previously taken out insurance policies on these fictitious family members, he collected a tidy sum, one in excess of $12,000. At this point, it was fortunate for Clara that she and her infant son returned to New Hampshire and never saw Holmes again. Just as suddenly, Holmes dropped out of sight. He turned up briefly in St. Paul and New York. Then, in 1885, at the age of 25, posing as an inventor, Holmes resurfaced in Chicago's north suburban town of Wilmette. Though he had not divorced his first wife, he was now married to Myrtle Z. Belknap, the daughter of a wealthy businessman. A man Holmes had unsuccessfully tried to swindle and to kill. It is unknown how many people Holmes may have killed between Michigan and Chicago. Maybe none. Maybe many.
What is the likelihood of Holmes having murdered additional people between his college experience and the beginning of his activities surrounding the World's Fair in Chicago? I think is very high. You know, we're talking about a person who, by the time he came to Chicago, had an elaborate fantasy that he was able to execute in an incredibly complicated and full-blown fashion. It strikes me that that kind of fantasy and the ability to execute that fantasy probably didn't spring into being all complete in Chicago. I think that it's probably very likely that he had additional experiences with murder in between college and the time he came to Chicago.
Holmes' first known killing was a Mrs. E.S. Holden. In 1887, H.H. Holmes began working as an assistant at a local drugstore in Chicago run by Mrs. E.S. Holden. An older woman who could not handle the trade any longer, she needed assistance. It was not long before Holmes seemed to be more the manager of the store and less the prescription clerk. In 1887, Mrs. E.S. Holden vanished without a trace. A short time after, Holmes announced that he had purchased the store from the widow, just prior to her moving out west. Now Holmes had a fabulous source of income. Then, at age 29, H.H. Holmes was about to blossom into America's most prolific and fiendish serial killer. Wealthy beyond his wildest dreams, Holmes concocted a killing scheme that would change the face of horror forever. He bought a lot across from his drugstore and built what has become known as the Castle of Horror, also known as the Murder Castle. Cunning as well as murderous, Holmes designed his three-story house of horrors to appear from the outside like any ordinary commercial building. Shops and his new drugstore occupied the bottom floor. But the upper two floors were a bizarre maze of torture rooms and execution chambers. Some rooms were windowless chambers with doors that could be opened only from the outside. Soundproofed rooms outfitted with gas lines allowed Holmes to hear the screams of his victims as they suffocated. It was a strange building with halls at odd angles and stairways that went nowhere. But the most ghoulish construction was the basement. Here was a dissecting room for stripping the flesh of his victims and making skeletons for medical schools. It also held 2 giant furnaces for cremating bodies. Holmes' House of Horrors would later become a staple of Hollywood and the Halloween haunted house. By 1892, Holmes' murder castle was complete. America's greatest serial killing spree was about to commence. At first, he advertised lodging to attract victims. Next, he put ads in small-town newspapers promising employment, particularly for young women. When they arrived, he took their money and they disappeared. But this was simply a lead-up to the stream of visitors arriving for the great Chicago World's Fair in 1893. The fair was a monument to architecture and the arts. But at the same time, it highlighted firsts that were to become the hallmark of United States industry and production. Easily prepared breakfast food, including Aunt Jemima pancake mix, Quaker oats, and cream of wheat, debuted at the World's Fair. But the highlight of the fair's firsts was the dazzling technological breakthrough by Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse, when they introduced the entire country to alternating current electrical power by lighting up the World's Fair. But with all the innovation, there also came a darker side to the fair's firsts. Murder. Murder most foul. Murder without remorse. Next to the fair stood H.H. Holmes' House of Horrors, the first building ever constructed for the sole purpose of serial killing. For 6 months, a reeling mass of humanity jammed the fairgrounds. Thousands of these carefree fairgoers would go missing. How many fell prey to Holmes's House of Horrors will never be known. When the Chicago Fair closed in October of 1893, Holmes decided to leave the Windy City. That's when Holmes got sloppy. He teamed up with 2 other con men, Benjamin Peitzel and Marion Hedgepeth, for another scam, this time in Philadelphia, and Holmes killed Peitzel. He was tracked down by a Philadelphia detective, eventually leading to a raid of Holmes' murder castle in Chicago. Here, police uncovered a macabre disassembly plant for human bodies. It was here that Holmes dissected his victims, stripped the flesh with powerful acids, and then sold their skeletons to medical schools across the country. Those he didn't dissect were burned in 2 furnaces he had specially constructed for that purpose, or they were cast into lime pits. The total number of victims will never be known, but evidence pointed to hundreds murdered. Confronted by the proof of his horrific crimes, Holmes admitted to hundreds of killings while in Chicago. He described his acts of murder methodically, without conscience, the way a man would describe butchering cattle. Indeed, throughout his confession, Holmes, America's most accomplished serial killer, sat stone-faced as he recited ghoulish details of the slaughter. Indeed, as many future serial killers would do when they were caught. In the early 20th century, psychologists were just coming to grips with the idea of a hidden dark side of the human subconscious. Replacing the idea of demon possession, it was the subconscious where unknown factors dwell. Deep, dark structures that could drive people to all manner of hideous acts, including murder.
We often go back to the concept or the possibility that something could be born to kill. There's a bad seed out there that, I do a 30-70 split. I think biology and genetics play about 30% role in who we are and what we do. We can't deny our past, our biological past. We know that we do inherit things. We are predisposed to lots of things. Doesn't mean we're going to do it, doesn't mean we're going to get it. I think that biology and genetics kind of loads the gun. But the other 70% is about nurturing or the lack of nurturing. And that part is the part that pulls the trigger.
Just as H.H. Holmes pulled the trigger on the emergence of the American male serial killer, so did Belle Gunness do the same for the American female serial killer. She combined profit with serial killing, enjoying both to the fullest. Born in Norway in 1859, Belle Gunness immigrated to the U.S. in 1881. By the turn of the century, her killing farm in LaPorte, Indiana, was ready to welcome a multitude of murder victims.
Belle Gunness was clearly a predatory female from the get-go. She was a Norwegian American who married, had kids, and routinely killed them to get insurance money. She had a husband. They probably burned down the businesses and collected the insurance